Rebel Devs Podcast, a show that challenges conventional thinking in the tech industry. Each episode features conversations with solutionists who have taken unconventional approaches to problem solving, pushing the boundaries of what's possible in their respective fields. Join the devolution.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Rebel Devs Podcast. Your host, Tom May here, just creator of chaos out in the world, and my partner in crime, Jonah May. Jonah May, how's the day looking for you so far?
It's looking interesting. I was at the data center yesterday, and it was a long day, so I kind of crashed afterwards, just woke up, and I'm getting going still. Kicking my day off with this podcast.
See, I heard kicking your day off with this podcast. This sounds like very Seinfeld-esque to me when we talk about it. Is it day off or is it day off with? Like, punctuation makes everything in that sentence. So I'm assuming you're working today. So, Seinfeld. I watched it last night. I'm in a Seinfeld mood. But everybody's tired of hearing from Tom and Jonah, so we have a special guest with us from Pure Storage, Falko. Welcome. How are you, sir?
I'm good, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. We're so glad you're here. Very infamous man in Veeam circles and other circles as well. I remember attending a very well-attended session at Veeam last year that you spoke about, and it's very exciting. I think you guys were moved to the main stage, were you not, at Veeam last year?
Yes, it was basically my, let's say, most crowded presentation I ever gave together with my buddy Jim Jones, and we delivered a, let's say, presentation on how to scale and architect Veeam Backup for M365 for enterprise companies, so meaning above 20K users, for example. And apparently the interest was so high that they moved us to the main stage, which was an amazing experience, to be honest.
It was a really great presentation. I appreciate it from my side. I had a customer come through and they were like, hey, we need to move like 3 million SharePoint sites. And I was like, okay, like totally we can do this, right? And I remember talking to Veeam and they were like, hey, can you guys do this? And I was like, well, sure, we can do this. But I was like, can you do this? You know? And your presentation helped quite a bit to bring some confidence there. So definitely appreciated that. And, for those of you listening, Falco's also a fellow Veeam Vanguard. I think he has longer tenure than Jonah and I. And here's a fun fact, Falco. When I was digging through my LinkedIn, just kind of clearing out my inbox, several years ago, I reached out to you because you actually helped write a study guide for VMCE. And that's where I first contacted you, I believe. And you were like, hey, I'm totally willing to help anybody out there. And two other Vanguards, Stephen New and Jonah May, they were kind of in their journeys of studying. I had already VMCE'd, but they were coming up through. And I was like, wow, here's a great study guide. So you were kind of integral in the rest of us kind of leveling up. So definitely a legend in its outright. So great to have you on board here. What I'd like to do is we've been talking about resilient storage here. Jonah and I have met with Rick Vanover. He kind of kicked off the whole series as the concept of just being resilient in storage. Before Veeam was even marketing this, Rick came on with us and talked about this idea. And it was really great because we often tell people in our consultancies, Veeam is technically not a security product, but in essence, it is part of your security strategy, and they're so mirrored. So when we started talking about the concept of birthing this, what is resilient storage, he came on and he said, I think we should really talk about this. And so we did, and we started getting into, 4 eyes protection and mutability and really having a great strategy. And Veeam is really locked onto this for obvious reasons. And so across the world of the Rebel Devs podcast, we've spoken to different companies, like we had Backblaze on recently, and we spoke about S3 storage and how it hooks in, and kind of a different animal here, but a little bit of a sort drawer. We kind of had Object First on a couple times. We had Anthony Cusimano, we had Jeff Burke, great friends of ours, tell us a little bit about Object First offerings and UPI and how it comes in. And knowing that you're a Pure guy and you're always dressed in orange, I kind of thought, well, hey, let's talk to Falco because I guess technically you're in a black shirt, since we don't have video, but there's a little orange there in the corner. I see a little logo there. I wanted to learn a little bit more about Pure and what makes Pure different for our listeners that may not be familiar with it. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Tell me what I need to know here. Give me the skinny here, my friend.
Yeah, sure. We really have a platform. And by platform, I mean, we don't, let's say, just produce simple storage systems or hardware. We have a platform which consists of, let's say, 5 major key technologies. And one of them is probably our most unique one, which is called the direct flash modules. So as you may know, Pure is not using HDDs or SSDs in its hardware. Pure is using direct flash modules. And direct flash modules, or just in short DFMs, are basically carriers where we put NAND flash on it. That means those carriers with the NAND flash cells on it is built solely by us, and you can only get them from us. And this, paired with another key technology called Purity, which is our operating system for systems, allows us to compare a little bit to Apple, for example, because Apple is also doing their iOS for their Apple devices, whereby Android, of course, as you all may know, an Android operating system needs to be run on a Huawei or a Samsung, on a Google Pixel, on different kind of platforms, whereby our platform and our operating system is really bound to our technology and our hardware here. And this really makes a difference because we can just be as, let's say, flexible, as efficient as possible because we develop the operating system and we don't have to rely on drivers from other companies or let's say the famous SSD translation layer in this case. And that really makes it unique. And when you look at our platform, we have different kind of technologies as well. So we have scale-up systems, which are our flash array systems. This means these are unified block and file systems with low latency from high performance to high capacity. But also we have our scale-out systems, which is mainly the FlashBlade. And those are filed objects systems with a very high throughput, a high performance to high capacity, and also a very unique approach in terms of architecture. And you mentioned other companies right here. And for example, when it comes to object storage, our FlashBlade system is pretty unique because it doesn't rely on databases or something. And in this case, we have a architecture which really scales out, and our blades in our FlashBlade system, for example, those of the performance data and the performance stats, they get better with every blade added to it and with every DFM because we really scale above every kind of compute node there. That's one of the major differences. So again, to rephrase, our Purity software operating system paired with our own built hardware makes the platform complete. On top of that, of course, we have a integrated software as a service management tool, which is called Pure One. There you can manage, orchestrate all your, let's say, systems in your fleet. And this is also paired with another unique, I would say, support model in the industry, which is called Evergreen. Evergreen is really something which is in our DNA, because Evergreen doesn't only mean you can buy some storage from us and run it for 5 to 10 years. Yes, we definitely say 10 years is possible. Also 15 years is possible. Evergreen also means when we go and develop better software, better Purity operating systems, you as a customer gain benefits from it as well. That means, for example, lately, we had a software upgrade from our Purity systems for our FlashBlade where we increased the efficiency. So every customer who updated to the newest version had a better efficiency and therefore had more storage capacity for free, which is amazing because you cannot just buy it. It's just there, just with an upgrade. So Evergreen is really in our DNA when it comes to design the products, design the hardware architecture for the next 10 to 15 years. And also how we think a subscription model and a software model should look like in the market. And by the way, a DFM, I just told you, those DFMs, those are capable of 24 terabytes, 48 terabytes, 75 terabytes. And we recently announced 150 terabytes and 300 terabytes in the future. And a DFM is as big as my iPhone, which I'm holding in the screen right now, which you cannot see in the podcast, obviously. But a DFM is a very small amount of, let's say, a storage device here. And if we can run 150 terabytes in, some days on it, you can just imagine how far this scales in the future and how small the footprint is. And that's basically everything, in a nutshell here. Maybe you got some questions around the whole platform here, Tom.
Yeah, I was going to actually open it up to Jonah a little bit before I flip over to him. What I'll say is I love the hardware integration. Myself working for Apple back in the day, that was really what I think brought about a lot of the quality in it, is the fact that it was a limited, especially when I was there, we were Intel based. We'd moved away from the RISC chips and moved to the x86s. And so a lot of people were like, well, it's just a computer, right? And I was like, yeah, but there's a limited hardware run that we had. So everything was tuned into that hardware so specifically. Whereas Windows, you had to have the HCL, you had to have layering. And so back in the days, Windows XP 7, they weren't really a solid operating system because they had to be so universal. So that's really awesome to hear about how it tunes into the hardware. Jonah, what's your thoughts with?
Well, I was actually going to ask and go a little bit away from our norm into more of maybe the hypervisor or DRAS side of things, because I think a lot of the times when we touch on storage in these podcasts, we stick to the BAS side of things. And, being at a service provider, it's not just Veeam Backup, it's also Veeam Replication and CDP. And so while it's definitely not as large of a slice in the market for us as traditional backup, because backup tends to be the most cost-efficient offering in the Veeam's backup and replication suite, we do have customer needs for it. And what I've seen and had some conversations with even VMware engineers over the years is, how do you design your storage to work for high-performance replication, minimizing snapshots done and achieving lower RPOs with replication, especially in the pre-CDP years. And so I think at one point, I'm going to give a name shout out here, John Nicholson told me, former Vanguard, was you kind of almost have 3 tiers of storage when it comes to VMware. And it kind of goes in line with cost, performance, and price along those. So what you see with a lot of people is iSCSI targets where you're limited to, 60 terabytes on a volume or 64 terabytes because of VMFS limits. And, it works. It's easy to set up, but that's kind of what it is. And then there's on the other end, vSAN, which is its own, complicated, licensed, high availability, clustered monster. But he had kind of told me kind of in between, there was this one that's not used very often called vVol. And Falko, I think you guys support vVol, but I don't really know much about vVol. So why don't you educate me a little bit on where that falls between iSCSI and the vSAN side of things?
Yeah, sure. So vVol, I guess, is a thing which we really started from the beginning, which we really tried to support as much as possible. A big shout out to my coworker. Coworker is a bad word, but to, let's say, the legend Cody Hosterman in the US, because he's really pushing this technology, and we really support the vVol functionality from a, let's say, very early stage. So as you may know, when we talk about vVols, we have to talk about VASA, so the vSphere API for storage awareness. And the vSphere API for storage awareness is something which is provided by the storage platform for the communication from VMware to the array. And the flash array, for example, which is our scale-up system, like I already mentioned, converts those API calls to flash array-specific requests. And that's why the vVol integration is so good right now, and that's why we push it so good. Fun fact, you just said there are some tiers of storage. I mean, I think I mentioned this already, but we have only one tier, right? We have only flash, so there's nothing else we can provide to you, unfortunately. But still, this is something which I guess is really crucial when it comes to performance also within vVols. So yeah, we have a big support matrix when it comes to vVols. The thing is, not really many people or customers jump on it from the day, because we have some limitations. And I'm just drawing it back to you, Jonah, because in my eyes, the perfect, let's say, integration also with a backup perspective, again, from Veeam, for example, is that we would be able to leverage storage snapshots for vVols. That's not possible due to VADP limitations right now. So the vSphere API for data protection doesn't allow me to snapshot a vVol on a storage or a SAN-based basis. If this is something which will be available in the next couple of years, for example, and this would be the perfect solution for like every customer, because you can really treat your virtual volume with your single VM as a single storage container, not only from a VMware first tier perspective, but also from a backup perspective. And that's why it makes it so interesting, I guess.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about the backup from storage snapshot side of that. So I'm glad you brought it up, because I'm starting to see more and more customers adopt it, but I see both with talking to some other service providers and a lot on the customer side. Like I said, a lot of people are using iSCSI, so they're not even really leveraging backup from storage snapshots. They're just using maybe at best direct SAN access with Veeam. And as a service provider, I'd have to follow up and do some more research on it, but the last I tried to go down the rabbit hole of backup from storage snapshots and service providers, as far as I could tell, there was no definitive document out there on the internet saying yes or no, as the service provider target, you can use backup from storage snapshots, because everything I was reading was, oh, let me use it to read the blocks with Veeam, not anything to do with writing it. So from my side, it was more the perspective of how do we minimize VM stuns, because we have seen even with high performance flash arrays, where snapshot removal times can take much longer than I feel, need to, especially given the deltas, and that can hang up customers that are wanting, 30 or 60-minute RPOs on replication jobs. And equally so, because Veeam as the target service provider keeps their changes in snapshots for replication, our challenge is, and has always been, load balancing and scalability. When you have a 64 terabyte VMFS volume and you have to migrate a VM in VMware to free up space on that data store because you're over 75 or 80%. Well, guess what? You have to disable the replication jobs because you have to consolidate snapshots because you can't vMotion with snapshots. So how do you get around that? And that's where kind of some of the conversations with John came about, because it sounded like vVol is effectively a limitation of several hundred petabytes or whatever your array can do rather than just 64 terabytes like the VMFS has.
Correct. Yeah, you're totally right. And fun thing is also, so when you talk about the flash array, for example, your performance, or let's say your capacity you get is always 100%. So don't limit you at 80% or 90%. So you can definitely use it as a whole system. Also, the thing is, how I would compare vVols when we talk about something else? I would compare vVols to the object storage of VMware, because the vVol itself is not a LUN, it's not a file share. It's just like instructions given from the storage system back to VMware, right? And you can size it, you can define it by policies and all that stuff, which makes it really easy to run, which also makes it easy to build up services because your virtual machine stays for its own. And I think that makes it pretty interesting. And that's also why we really push it, because we have a big integration and a big development going on with vVols, and because it makes just things easier, right? We all know about all those, let's say, problems we had in the past with snapshot limits on a VMFS data store or with NFS data stores where we had to right size correctly and all that stuff. So it makes it just easier for the virtual machine to be present on the VMware environment as when we use storage like NFS or block storage. And that's my take on it, I guess.
Yeah, I know it's definitely something I'm going to be looking to more in the future as a service provider, to maybe take some strain off of our internal tech ops teams. Like I said, I feel like a lot of our time and energy is spent on how do we load balance and how do we migrate workloads and make sure we're not over provisioning, and what happens when a customer grows and we have to move them or another customer to a different data store. Even on the BAS side, we see the problem. Veeam has helped a little bit with some of the newer data mover being integrated into some of the sober PowerShell commands and stuff, but I do really think the future of that side of things is going to be object storage as it increasingly gets to a point where it's stable at larger and larger capacities for service providers. So it's interesting to hear that maybe vVol is, like you said, the object storage of the VMware side for the DRAS, where maybe at some point in the future, we can see service providers that, no longer have to worry about, hey, how do I migrate customers around and impact their backup windows? Hey, let's just throw another shelf in, add it to the vVol or the object storage array, let it rebalance itself behind the scenes, and we're done. No further maintenance needed. I really hope and see that being the future of service providers.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And when we get back to the storage snapshot thing again, so I'm just throwing something in here. Snapshots are not backups, right? So also, when we talk about backing up, for example, a vVol, and let's just imagine, don't imagine, but right now, when we snapshot a storage volume, for example, with storage snapshots, we always take all the machines which reside in that storage volume with the actual job. So that means when you really want to disaster recover or instant recover or what else, just a single virtual machine, you would always have to revert the whole snapshot of that whole volume. So if at some point the VADP API is capable of doing this for a vVol, for example, you can just do it for your single virtual machine on your single vVol, right? And not for the whole volume where maybe 10, 20, 30, 50 VMs reside on it, which makes it even more accurate and even more easier for you. especially for migrating stuff, for example.
Right, but like you said, to your point, snapshots are not backups, and I've even almost taken that approach with both, not just the backup from storage snapshot perspective, but the DRAS perspective as well, because DRAS is great, but one of the challenges I have with DRAS is, you talked about VMware snapshot limits. We see that all the time because a customer wants to hypothetically say, run the replication job every 1 hour. Well, you have a certain number of snapshots that a virtual machine can have on it in VMware, at least with VMFS. And that means that you can only have a certain number of Veeam restore points with us because we have those same limitations. And like I said earlier, replication at least tracks changes through snapshots on the target replica. CDP gets around that a little bit, but typically that means with customers, you're only looking at maybe 3 or 4 days at best of retention on their replicas is what we see. And unless you go something immutable on the storage array level, which can potentially cause problems with Veeam processing, Veeam doesn't really have a true ransomware solution for the DRAS side like they do with backup, where you can have, your object storage with S3 object lock or your hardened Linux repositories or so on. So I've always sold customers as, hey, for even, like I said, replication and backup from storage snapshots, they're great, they're fast, but what happens when someone goes in and deletes them? Or what happens when ransomware decides to wait a few days before it encrypts everything and it puts in a time bomb? Like, you don't need to have all of your mission critical servers on DRAS. If you have a 24-hour RTO, that's where maybe you would go BAS only for a machine. But every machine that's in DRAS should also be in BAS. That way you have that longer retention. And ideally, you never use those restore points. You always spin up those tier 0 and tier 1 machines from your replicas. But God forbid something happens to those replicas, they get deleted. There's that time bomb. You can go back to an older restore point using your backup chain that's protected with ransomware insider protection or S3 object lock or XFS hardening.
Yeah, totally. So when we go into the direction, you just pointed it out. So Veeam has very good capabilities right now or nowadays when it comes to ransomware-proof backup storage systems. Let's talk about the hardened Linux repository a little bit. I like it, but I think it also needs some sort of, let's say, added security on top of it. And that's why we always pitch, for example, when we use our flash array systems, our safe mode snapshots, because the hardened Linux repository itself is a immutable file bit on the XFS file system, which is good. But if you gain access to that server, if you gain access to that compute box where you can just simply delete volumes, for example, it doesn't really make sense. So that's why we really like to say, hey, go one step back, look at it again, and maybe decide to divide compute and storage again, have an x86 box, for example, hosting the Linux, and have a flash array with the volumes provided for the x86 box to get the XFS volumes up and running, and then put our safe mode technology on top. So safe mode is something which you will find in our portfolio, in our platform very often, because safe mode is our approach on locking or doing snapshots on NFS shares, on SMB shares, on volumes, which you cannot delete. So also as an admin, you can't delete it. Also a ransomware cannot delete it. You can only modify it by calling the pure technical support and have 2 guys handy in your organization so they really can say, yeah, we both want the modification done by the technical support. So this is something which is really key to, say, further enhance a hardened Linux repository. But I guess everyone has another take on that. What do you say about this?
I kind of like you said, I like hardened repositories, but I think they have some limitations. My big problem with it, and maybe this is solved in the future by some enhancements to some of the scripts Veeam has started releasing for people to use, but in their setup, there is a specific step that I think that it seems a lot of customers miss that I'm going to call out. That's kind of like, hey, anything you're going to want to be able to do that normally requires sudo, make sure to add it to, this file so you don't have to use sudo for it. Since Veeam designs it so that there's only one sudo user and you remove sudo when you're done, right? During your setup. So in a lot of cases, well, I'm going to go Ubuntu specifically because that's kind of my bread and butter here. Well, apt-get update and upgrade. If you forget to add those, how are you going to update any software packages? How are you going to install security updates? I mean, even personally, I made sure when setting up a hardened Linux repository in my home lab to go and set those commands so I wouldn't have to have sudo for them, only to then later go try out a ConnectWise demo and go to install their RMM agent. and it wanted, maybe it was because it was using dpackage or something else. I don't remember for sure, but it was like, hey, you need sudo for this. And I couldn't get around that other than maybe booting into single user mode and doing all these hoops that I had to jump through. And trying to do that through iDRAC, it didn't want to boot into single user mode for whatever reason, or maybe it was disabled because it was the latest LTS. I don't know, but it eventually ended up with spending several hours trying to figure out this workaround, and I couldn't, which I guess is great because it means a malicious actor would have an annoying time trying to get around those privileges to delete things. But it also meant I ended up having to reinitialize the RAID arrays inside of the RAID controller and start from scratch, just so that before I locked everything down, I could go install that RMM package.
Yeah, I totally think what you just said is basically also applicable when it comes to the hackers or the ransomware guys, because I always try to, when we talk about cyber resiliency, when I talk about the whole data protection thingy, I always try to talk in layers. So the first layer, let's assume we have a hard Linux repository there, and it's based on an x86 box and flash array system and maybe some software around it. Then the first layer would be a very hard Linux operating system. The second layer would be a very good and a very hard out-of-band management system like iDRAC, like ILO, like IMM, how all these things are called. And then the next layer would be the storage, which serves the XFS volumes, where the storage is also immutable, for example, with our SafeMode technology. So you have different types of layers, which makes it even more harder for another person to breach or to break those things. And I think there's no 100% guarantee on anything here when it comes to ransomware and all those, let's say cyber threats, but just introducing more layers and more features to make it the life hard for those people just makes sense from my eyes.
Yeah, and I agree. Where I was going with it is kind of, it almost seems like in some cases with how the Linux hardened repository is designed today, unless you really know what you're doing, you're hardening it at the sacrifice of your own maintenance and security capabilities. Because what happens, long term, there's a 0-day vulnerability that you need some special sudo command to run. It's almost like the hardened repository is designed to set it and never patch it, never touch it, just let Veeam do its stuff. And as a security person who's used to 0 days and other vulnerabilities or even software changes, like I said, we decide we want to go use ConnectWise later instead of insert whatever other RMM. It's challenging to have to work around those problems or even use something that's designed to be static and never changed.
An unpatched system is always a vulnerable system. That's what you're basically saying. And that's it, right? So, and if we play this game completely, we also have to talk about monitoring, So you don't even have to be sudo, right? You can just have a root login or an admin login to the out-of-band management. So you don't have to even get to the operating system. You can just delete the volume on the x86 out-of-band management, for example.
That's what I did. I went in through Dell iDRAC 7. I rebooted the machine. I did the whole control R to enter the PERT controller, and I fast initialized the arrays.
And that's probably even faster than tinkering around with sudo commands, right? So, and that's also a thing which I'm kind of wondered why all those server manufacturers don't have read-only ports on their systems, because you have to monitor, right? You don't have to put your hard Linux repository in that rack and like you just said and forget it. You have to completely monitor the system. You have to know if there's a drive failing or if there's a power supply failing. But how do you do this without an out-of-band management connected to it?
Yeah, well, and you can do it, and you can make read-only users, but it's honestly, at least from the Dell perspective, not even useless, just complicated to set up. I mean, Dell does have software like Open Manage Enterprise or Essentials, whatever it's called now. They've changed the name a couple of times, where you can centrally consolidate your iDRAC alerts, and you can set SNMP or syslog forwarding and all of that for your disk failures, but it's very limited on the free tier. So if you're a small business buying some secondhand Dell servers, maybe a 12th or 13th gen PowerEdge, it's not really very efficient or capable of doing what you need it to do. And yeah, you could theoretically make your own aggregator like a Zabbix or something, but then that means every time you add a new server, you then have to go set up the read-only user. You have to, and even Dell Open Manage has some of these problems. You have to go create your read-only user. You have to go turn on SNMP. You have to go do whatever in iDRAC to then add it to the system. It's not just an easy adoption process. With a read-only account, like you said, on the flip side, of something that's a little easier to adopt and monitor, like an Ubiquity device, for example.
Correct. I totally agree. And I think that's it just adds more complexity, which you hopefully sort out with more automation. So this is basically the thing which you're talking about. When we talk about object storage, for example, I think object storage is really, let's say, the primary storage in the next couple of 5 to 10 years. So that's my take on it. And it's basically also why I joined Pure, because the whole architecture we have within our FlashBlade systems is so unique, which makes me feel that this kind of technology is really key for every kind of application or every kind of use case out there. So my take on it is object storage will be primary storage in hopefully 10 years. Also, when we talk about containerization, right, when we talk about the whole cloud DevOps approach here, everyone needs object storage right now. What do you guys feel about this?
I agree. I think even for the common end user using Veeam, object storage is already there. I think that where you find your limitations are your very large enterprises or your service providers still. I know Jim Jones has talked at length about some of the optimization work they've had to do with Ceph and Veeam to get their clusters to perform at scale. I know we have seen similar both here at CyberFortress and in my previous role at Global Data Vault with both BBR and VB365. You know, some of it has been Veeam learning object storage and the most efficient way to make API calls and handle blocks. Some of it has been Ceph scalability issues itself. But kudos to the large S3 providers out there, the Amazons, the Wasabis, the Backblazes of the world, because they really have figured out how to get their clusters to scale and perform at large scale, where I think a lot of service providers are still trying to figure that out. The challenge, of course, I have as a service provider is then it has its own cons, right? Like then I'm not I could use a Backblaze or a Wasabi, but then I'm not hosting your data in my data center. And that's a big push of service providers is I can go touch the server with your data on it and I add additional value beyond Veeam. And equally so, if I go push it out to a Backblaze or Wasabi, I have some limitations when I'm trying to restore that data back. You know, latency is not as good, which makes instant recovery almost unusable, where I could use that today to give a customer at least some access to their systems if they're not using DRAS. And equally so, I'm limited by my bandwidth or the bandwidth at that S3 provider for recoveries, where maybe I can hit, 12, 15, or even 18 gigabit on restores with vMotion and concurrent tasks in my data center today, even on spinning drives. Hosting those backups, I might only be able to hit, 5 gigabit or something like that with a Wasabi or a Backblaze if we had the bandwidth capabilities.
Yeah, mostly it's just about the three things you just mentioned. It's about the performance itself, it's about the latency, and it's also about the metadata performance. Because, for example, when we talk about the Veeam integration, or let's say not only Veeam integration, we as Pure Storage, for example, also integrate into Commvault, into Veritas, and all the other backup vendors right there, because everyone is doing object storage nowadays. Who would have thought? It's also about metadata performance, because metadata in, let's say, other solutions out there is not trimmed to be as performant as possible. And it was never meant to be, right? S3 and object storage was never meant to be the blazing fast solution for primary workloads, for example, or for very high demanding read workloads when it comes to backups, for example, when you have to restore. And that's a unique thing which we also think is on our side because of our architecture. As you may know, some vendors out there rely on databases. For example, we don't. So we have a big key value store where every object gets a key value pair and is placed on every blade in our FlashBlade system. And we have two kind of, let's say, flavors of FlashBlade systems. One is the FlashBlade S, which stands for speed. Not just joking, but we have a FlashBlade S, and then we have a FlashBlade E. And the FlashBlade E is our, let's say, very big, extensive FlashBlade system where you can store a lot of data, and it starts with roughly 4 petabytes. Whereby the FlashBlade S, for example, starts with, I think, 70 terabytes. So you really can scale from a speed or from a density perspective here. And like I just said, S3 and object storage was never meant to be as fast as possible due to the fact that our software and our hardware with their own Flash DFM modules, for example, is just so bound together. We can really deliver great values in great numbers. So maybe I can share some of them. For example, our S systems, our FlashBlade S systems deliver something around 7 gigabytes per second on the write. And like, depends obviously on a network, on the source data store and so on, up to 25 gigabytes for read, because flash is always good for reading, right? And this just makes sense from a scale perspective.
Yeah, and I really like that you touched on that, because that is the exact issue I've been encountering. S3 was never designed to be blazing fast, and getting into S3 softwares out there in the community like a Minio or a Ceph, that's the biggest problem I've seen. Is like Ceph by default, even these days, is still really built to be spinning disks with some sort of flash, whether it be SSD or NVMe cache for the OSDs. It's not designed out of the box to have your flash devices be your OSDs, which is where people are starting to trend for some of that higher performance. But it means you have to put a lot of performance tunes in place, and even then the software can only do so well to keep up. From the software perspective, there are a couple providers out there that have worked to solve the software side of things. The big one I can think of is Weka FS, but wow, last I checked, they are expensive, especially when you're talking going from a Ceph or a Minio to them for their software. But to be fair, they scale to capacity, and you're talking dozens or even potentially hundreds of gigabytes per second read and write speeds with their software, because they put so much time and energy and effort and money into developing software that is designed for those speeds.
Yeah, it's basically almost from a performance perspective like our story, because, for example, when you look out and look for object storage vendors, you will always see some sort of limitations based on how many objects per bucket, how many terabytes per bucket, for example. We are so convinced from our own architecture that we don't give you those limitations. If you order, for example, a flash blade with 100 terabyte capacity, that's the only limit, by the way. So there's no other limits there. There's no limit in how many objects, how big the object should be. We don't care if it's 1 kilobyte or if it's 8 megabyte. That's basically your only limit. And that's why the architecture really is completely unique from everything I've seen so far. And that's why I joined Pure and why I think object storage can be the primary one in the next couple of years.
I'm going to talk to my experience with Ceph just a little bit, kind of what you've all said, but more from the business process side. Cost. Ceph, when implemented, was very, very expensive. And I'm not talking in a pure sense here. I'm talking more of a build it your own. You find the hardware, you source the hardware, you bring into Ceph, and now you're stuck into open source. What a nightmare. We were configuring RAID card drivers. Like, I was an early adopter of Linux, late 90s in there, mid 90s, somewhere in there. And it was great, but you had to compile everything, drivers, everything. Flash forward to, 2015, if you will, 16, somewhere in there. Now we're back in the Ceph world. What are we doing? We're compiling our own drivers. We're getting drops. We're trying to figure out all of these limitations. And when we're hitting walls, we're going to the community, which community is a great thing. We're all ears, supporters of the community. That's not really a production system. So then you work through that all. And so now you're adding in increased support costs in there, not in a support contract, but in staff and knowledge. And typically in an organization, it's coming at the expense in the fact that they should be out there generating revenue. Now they're supporting internal. So you have that additional cost. Then you finally get it to almost work, because I don't think it was ever really clear. Now, when we talk about the cost, back then, this was before erasure coatings and different things as well. So I know it's gotten a little more efficient. What were we dealing with? Basically, at least for every one drive percentage, you almost needed a total of 3 to be able to properly cluster it out. So now, while it was resilient, it would stay up. You wouldn't have these issues. It was highly expensive to run a non-production storage array to put where my backups would be. So that is a huge, huge, huge challenge. One of the things that we used to look at from the accounting side, and whenever I talk about the accounting departments, I always picture Dilbert, and they used to be like accounting is like the guardians to the gates of hell. So jabbing at my accounting friends, but I live there, right? It's always budget, budget, budget. If you could find a company that could provide S3 properly, and it was not your problem, and you believe that they could provide it, suddenly you can pay a little bit of that premium because it's still less than where you're at. So as you start shopping the vendors around and looking, you're like, this is wonderful. So as we look at the Backblaze, we look at the Wasabis from the consultancy side, I'm not a service provider per se. We do offer a little bit of it, but our mainstay is professional services. I look at every single customer we speak to and we're like, hey, it's great. Go with your second data center. Go to a cloud service provider. Go to an 1111 Cyber Fortress, whoever, pick your poison. You're there. Great. Look at you being 321 compliant. You're awesome, right? Why not get into an S3 storage? Why not drop in a Backblaze, a Wasabi? For $6 to $8 a terabyte. Yes, it's self-serve. It lives somewhere else in that tertiary mindset. And that's what I love about S3 is when presented as a tertiary solution, it's spot on. As we start consulting and talking to customers and going, listen, I'm glad that you have an insert random storage on site here. Are you really taking advantage of this immutability, this lock, this scalability? And from my standpoint, they're not. And they go, well, we are tossing it over to an S3 provider. Look at us being immuted up in the clouds and having multiple tiering in Veeam. Well, you guys are awesome, but we don't know our recovery. Closer to the source is a better recovery. It's nice to see the pivot now that we can do this on site. We can get a pure box. We can hook it in with a few clicks. It can be there, local, immuted, protected, isolated, performing in the backup environment. And that final bucket all the way across, the fourth level, the sixth level, whatever, is immuted at a Backblaze, etc. over there. So it's really exciting to see that. And what I love is, as I tell customers, don't build it yourself. And it used to be a stretch. Let's talk Linux hardened repository for a moment, guys, right? This is thrown around in my world so much. Somebody pops out there and Googles it. They see it's a Veeam feature. They find Rick Vanover's post and they're like, look, here's what I do with Ubuntu, which is awesome, right? And not to knock anything, but in the Veeam development channels, while it's supported, I don't know after the initial release how much of a touch point we've had to say new kernels, new lockdowns, new vulnerabilities. Are we updating the scripts? Should we run the auto script? Once it's in place, what's our management look like? Do we unharden it to patch it, bring it up? How do our monitoring systems come in? There are so many questions now, unless you are a Linux guru. I have one on staff at Different Dev. Unless you're this person that lives and breathes Linux, and those guys love to be complicated, it's not viable for an organization. If you are supporting some business line, like all of our customers do, you are, let's just make up a hypothetical nursing facility. You are providing medical services to a customer. That is your billable rate. That's where you are. You are the IT shop on site. You should be supporting the billing and revenue of your organization, not spending countless hours looking to a hardened repository, figuring out how you will make it safe, only to find out at one key critical time it's not in an event. That's not when you want to find out. Whereas when we buy a Pure, when we recommend a product like that, we trust that vendor. And that's why you're here today, Falko, is because we believe in your product that this is a real viable thing. This isn't like Pure's paying us money to have you on here. We're just like, we know Falko. He's a straight shooter. He's not going to sit out there and work for a company that's garbage. And so when we look at your product, we're like, we believe you when you say these things hold true in your storage. And we can go to a customer and say, look at this device. It has passed the litmus tests of what we need. You will not be supporting this archaic system. You'll have a learning curve, learning Pure, right? Like anything else, it's just a little different of what you've done before, but you guys have your own operating system, as you say, and clickety click, 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 it's there. You're not worrying about compatibilities and drivers and everything else, especially because you're locked in that hardware model. So that's my takeaway from a business standpoint. Some people will say to me, well, Pure is really expensive, sometimes they say. And I'm just like, but factor in everything I just shared with you. Suddenly you run the math. No, it is a very great priced product because I'm not putting support staff in. I'm not spending countless hours. And I can make a phone call. It's all there. So when you run a true analysis from a IT financial audit, which we do, suddenly you find out, no, you're spending a lot less because it's kind of like we always have shadow IT work out there. this is an example, I think, of a shadow IT cost. It's never documented ever. But if you talk to that guy that has to support it, oh, he's losing his mind in 8 different areas in the company. And now he's got to worry about this. And why isn't it working? And you're calling Veeam support and they're literally showing you logs going, no, we issued a call. It should be doing it. Whereas you engage Pure, you can tell us down to the exact log hit what's working, what's not, and why, and the integration. And I don't know if we want to continue down the S3 still. I'd love to hear a little bit more even about the Commvault, Veritas, or some of the other providers you work with, not normally in our wheelhouse, but we were speaking and you wanted to open it up a little broader. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that if you still have some time here, because I think we have about 10 more minutes on the episode. So if we can end on that, I think that would be pretty good. But Jonah or Falko, did you want to throw anything in after what I said before we change gears?
Yeah, just 2 things before we switch gears. So learning curve is a great word, which you just said. You probably have no learning curve with Pure at all because it's so simple. That's what we know for. So simplicity is something which is in our DNA as well. If we continue with S3, you create your bucket, you edit the bucket and enable versioning and object lock. And then just add it to your application, then you're good to go. You don't have to touch it anymore. So that's pretty solid learning curve there, and it's really easy to operate. And I really liked what you were saying about in the beginning about compiling software for your Ceph environment and basically for seeking the same thing we do, having a perfect combination integration between the software and hardware, which you are trying to manually achieve, which we try to deliver to you as a customer. That's why our platform is so good, because the purity and the own built hardware we have fits like perfectly together. That's what you're trying to achieve with your Ceph environment. Going for the best drivers, going for the best, let's say, software add-ons around, and going for the best hardware and software compatibility matrix. That's something we deliver to you as a customer. And furthermore, the price point is always relative, right? If you do the math correctly, and if you do a really complete total cost of ownership calculation, and if you don't compare it to, I switch my storage every 3 or 5 years, but if you compare it to, I'm going to let my Pure storage run for the next 10 years because that's what we guarantee to you, and then do to complete total cost of ownership there, you will see that in the long run, we are obviously cheaper because it's not only the storage cost, it's not only the software cost, it's also the people who are maintaining that. It's the people you hire, the people who work at your organization, at your company, who needs to deal with the migration, who needs to deal with the software around it and all that stuff. So in the long run, it's really something which is very convenient for you as a customer. And if you want to keep the storage system longer than 10 years, for 15 or 20 years, you can do it as well. We just swing by with a swing shelf, migrate the data for you because you already paid for it. And then you got the newest version, the newest hardware in your rack. So that's part of our Evergreen DNA. And just wanted to mention this before we switch gears and go to the Commvault stuff, for example. Maybe, Jonah, do you have something to say about this as well? Or
I don't think so. I think y'all have pretty well covered it. I mean, that's a lot of discussions I have at my service provider from the product engineering perspective, you know, interfacing with my boss, who is also our CEO, and finance, and figuring out, like you said, what's the cost of labor to support something on our tech ops team? You know, how often are we planning hardware refreshes? What does it look like to migrate that data and the labor it involves? How much does it cost to purchase hardware every 3 to 5 years versus if something's twice as expensive, but it lasts 10 years. Well, right there, we're break even before any of those other factors I've already said.
Yeah, that's basically it. That's basically what I'm trying to say here. And that's something which is really unique because I don't know any vendor out there who is supporting their hardware for like 10 years or even more. And that's something which we, also from an ESG approach, of course, which we want to do better and which we want to, let's say, also reduce e-waste and stuff. Because why should you always throw out your storage after 3 years and just buy a new one? Because it doesn't really make sense. If you get the newest hardware, if you get the newest version of software, you can run it for the next 10 years. And that's something which is also part of the Evergreen. But let's switch gears to Commvault. So, Tom, that's basically one thing why I joined Pure as well. So I'm responsible for Germany right now as a field solutions architect for data protection. That means I not only cover Veeam, but I also have the chance to cover other data protection solutions like Commvault, like Veritas. We also have integrations with Rubrik and Quasity, for example, which really makes it pretty interesting for my job description here. And what we see, for example, as well as that Commvault has a pretty deep integration with our platform as well. So Commvault has a feature called IntelliSnap. Maybe you know it. IntelliSnap allows you to leverage basically every kind of storage snapshot you want to, not only for virtual machines, but also for databases, for example, for applications. That's something where our platform is also very tightly built into. And of course, as a backup target, we can also leverage our block, file, or S3 systems there. And Commvault has a different approach than Veeam. So Commvault has a global dedupe database, which gets striped across all those media agents. And you see, I am really trying to show off my Commvault knowledge here, because that's something I have to learn. But also, it's very interesting to do so. And what makes it so unique is that all those media agents here have the whole deduplication database and hold it onto together. So that means every I/O goes through those media agents. With S3, for example, and that's why I always say S3 is the future, you really bypass those media agents and write directly into the S3 systems, which is the FlashBase here, for example. And also the restore goes directly from S3 back to the client. That's a feature called Storage Accelerator, which really makes sense also from a high enterprise class scale perspective. Just imagine all those solutions out there run on NFS, for example, or Block. When it runs with S3, you have different TCP threads. You have a lot of sessions which get created and pushed to the FlashBlade system. So it means the load gets, I'm missing the word right now, but the load gets paired excellently to all those blades in our system, which makes it really perfect for a condition for our system, because we love parallelism. And this is something which is deeply integrated here as well. Also, from a Veritas perspective, it's basically the same story. We have partnership with them. We can leverage the whole repository kind of thing with our block and object storage systems. And it's really interesting to see that object really is, let's say, the one thing everyone focuses right now on as a backup target, because it's so simple for the customer. It's so simple for the administrator. Just create your bucket. You got your access key, secret key, which is nothing more than your username and password. Just create your repository and let it run, right? You don't have to resize volumes. You don't have to provision new volumes. You don't have to adjust them. It's just there. The bucket can be 1 kilobyte big or 1 petabyte big. It doesn't really matter, right? That's why it makes it so simple and why it's so interesting.
No, absolutely. And I love talking about some of the other technologies out there. I was one of the first MCSEs, and I don't mean like number one, but, you know, in the first batch that came out in there back in the 3.5.1.4 days, like dinosaur here. But I really became that card-carrying member of all things Microsoft. I told you I dabbled with Linux because it was kind of like, wait, this Unix world, like we could justify that pretty easily. We'd never put it into production. But from a learning standpoint, we were so entranced with this whole Unix thing. I transfer over to an Apple world, and essentially I have gone to the dark side. It was like, I just felt like I violated my moral compass. I felt dirty every day at work until I started to realize, I think when we choose hardware or systems, I think the best way I always equate it to religion, in the fact that maybe it's my view of it is, you know, is there really a right one or wrong one? No, there's positives to some, negatives to the other. But it seems like once you're in it, you're kind of now a member of it because you know it. Right? If I tomorrow decided I'll be a Buddhist and I'm not a Buddhist today, I really don't know much else other than a few little things I learned, you know, in a middle school or high school sort of thing. I can't really be an expert there. But if you start moving up more of the religion that I grew up in and was around, you know, I'll have a better knowledge base and I'm comfortable there. So as we talk about all things Veeam, I know myself, I'm very comfortable there. Prior to that, it was the Assay world. It was the StorageCraft world. It was the Platespin world. And it was like tech. And then I even remember the initial tests with Veeam when I was around, and it was like, oh, well, there's this Zerto thing. There's this Veeam thing. Where are we in this world? Which is the right path? And I just remember going, man, not even everybody's using virtual machines at this point, but I know everybody will be there. This is like Veeam 4. I know we're going to eventually get there, but I think Zerto's got the leg up the way they're doing it. And I remember looking at the cost. I was like, good God, that's expensive. And we went the Veeam route. And it took a good 2 to 3 years before this was even a viable product. Like, this was in our product suite of such a low adoption rate. I think we were barely using it internal to, 3-4 years later, it flips complete. StorageCraft goes away. Now it's all about this product. So I've seen that. So when we talk about the Commvaults, the Veeams, and whatever, I don't think we really do our jobs if we tout ourselves just as an expert of Veeam to not even have knowledge in there and to be open to the Commvault conversations. Equally so, I know a lot of the Veeamers, they look for those competitive analysis. And you know what? Honestly, sometimes someone builds a better mousetrap. And what do they say? I think it's kind of like they say the best form of flattery is impersonation or something like that. And so as people look at other products and they say, oh, they're doing that, then they start going, well, we should do that. Come on. That's where Veeam is with CDP. For years, it was like Zerto's kicking our butt over here. We need CDP. We're there. We can't steal their technology. Boom. There we go. And so I think as we look to Commvault, I know I like learning more about it. We're definitely coming to the end of our episode here. So just to pay the bills a little bit, Falko, where do we learn more about Pure? Do we contact you? Do we go to sales? How do we find you? What should we know? Websites, all that good stuff. How do we find Pure?
Yeah, so obviously purestorage.com. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search for my name. Also connect with me over my blog, virtualhome.blog, for example. But if you really want to learn more about Pure Storage, just try to hit me up and we can obviously, go and show you something which you hopefully will like.
Awesome. Jonah, tell us a little bit. Cyber Fortress, my partner in crime over there. We're a great alliance with Cyber Fortress. We do a lot of business with you all. Here you go, man. Plug it. Your marketing team will be proud.
Right. Yes, so you can find out more about us by going to cyberfortress.com. And, we talk a lot about Veeam on this podcast because Veeam's kind of our bread and butter. Mine, yours, Falko's. But Cyber Fortress, actually, we don't just offer Veeam as a service provider. We have about a dozen other backup products as well, such as Asse and Asigra. So if you're listening to this and you're not a user of Veeam, you already have your existing solution, you're happy with it, and you're looking for a service provider, reach out to us. Maybe it's one of the solutions we also offer.
Very good. When I think Cyber Fortress, I think the one-stop shop for all things backup, as far as I'm concerned when I talk to customers.
Yep. That's exactly what our goal is.
Over at Different Dev, paying our bills, differentdev.com. We are your one-stop shop for all things Veeam, but think about it this way. We like to say we take Veeam beyond the clicks. Anybody can set it up. Anybody can figure it, but we can monitor it. We can manage it. We can watch it. We can put it in our cloud. We can have it in your cloud. We implement, but more importantly, anything else is, I think our power and our namesake is in what we call Veeam Optimization Review. We come in, we're an independent auditor. We review everything in your environment, what's there, even if you have existing providers, and we provide this true gap analysis and roadmap. We fully document out your network, and this is something in today's landscape that you need. You have cyber insurance, you're going to need to back up something about your due diligence. So reach out to us at Different Dev. Falko, Jonah, thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to play us out with some cool music, guys. Thanks again for playing with us. All right, time to dance.
Whether you're a seasoned solutionist or just starting out, the Rebel Devs podcast is a must listen. So join us. Comment, share, and subscribe. Be part of the Rebel Devs.